Welcome to another episode of Judgment Date. Today, I really do have wonderful privilege of welcoming my dear friend and esteemed colleague, Judge Edwin Cameron, or Justice Edwin Cameron, onto the program. Justice Cameron, as many would know, most people would know, had an incredible judicial career. Of course, that was preceded by many other wonderful careers, but the point was that he was a member, a very important member of the Constitutional Court until very recently. And now, as typifies his sort of commitment to society as a whole, he's the inspecting judge of the Judicial Inspectorate for Correctional Services. The reason, however, that I wanted to ask Judge Cameron to talk to us was a quite extraordinary article that he wrote recently, which was in News 24. I do apologize to the hosts of our program that it was on a competitive outlet, but it's an article which is absolutely makes for compelling reading, and bearing in mind that we have been talking about the consequences of COVID. That was the very purpose of all of these programs that we've had. His article is entitled, "To Enforce the COVID Lockdown, Did We Wage a War on the People of South Africa?" And if I just might, I can't obviously go through the whole article, but I want to actually ask Judge Cameron about many of these issues. But what he does say, if in one of the paragraphs, which gives you a flavor, the trauma of both the COVID-19 illness and death and the securitization and militarization of this public health emergency will for years be marked on bodies and communities. South Africa is not alone, and then he goes on. Are we there? I mean, you were obviously prompted, Edwin, to write this because, quite understandably, with your disquiet with what was going on with COVID, did some of that have to do with your experience in prisons, or was it a broader lens?
It was both, Dennis. And of course, it was also my experience as someone living with AIDS, because
yes, of course.
COVID is our second democratic pandemic of death and disability and stigma and contagion. The first one was AIDS. And Dennis, we did a lot of things wrong with AIDS. The most catastrophic being the elite's connivance with President Thabo Mbeki's AIDS denialism, where business leaders, the ANC itself, many leaders remained silent while he queried the causes of AIDS. And more importantly, while he queried the treatments of AIDS, which eventually led the Treatment Action Campaign led by Zaki Ahmed to take him to court, and they got a court order against him. So we did a lot of things wrong with AIDS, but the thing we did right, and here we must give credit to the chair of the Parliamentary Committee on Justice, the Portfolio Committee on Justice, Johnny de Lange at the time. Johnny did a lot of wrong things which are pertinent to what we're talking about at that same time in the late 1990s. He introduced minimum sentences. He introduced life sentences. And it was the politicians' quick fix to a big problem. With AIDS, we paused for a moment. There are about 20 or 30 countries in Africa that enacted vicious repressive laws that said if you expose someone to HIV, you go to jail for a very long period. We didn't do any of that. So we did not adopt the big stick approach to AIDS. We embraced the public health model, which says you deal with a health threat by public health interventions for the public, for the health of the public. That was what we reversed with COVID, catastrophically. We didn't take the lesson. With COVID, to President Ramaphosa's great credit, he's followed the science. But our great mistake here was not to follow the public health model in public management of the disease.
Well, that's the interesting thing. If I could just go back to that, because of the AIDS issue was very much on all our minds. And of course, you being somewhat modest because you were very active at the time, and as a sitting judge were incredibly brave in calling out the President, Mbeki at the time. But at the end of the day, we finally did get our act together. And we did roll out antiretrovirals, and we allowed people to live with AIDS in a manner which, despite all, what's worrying me at the moment is that, we aren't allowing people to live with COVID because we've made such a botch up of the of the vaccine. I mean, we seem to be worse in some ways than we were.
It's very troubling indeed, Dennis. We've got the world's biggest publicly provided antiretroviral treatment program. I'm one of nearly 5 million people in South Africa who owes my life, my presence here with you today, to antiretrovirals. I took my ARVs a couple of hours ago. So we know how to do it. And the important thing to make as well, it's not often said, government's ARV program is a public-private partnership. There are NGOs, there are private organizations. Much of it is funded by PEPFAR, by United States AID dollars. So we know how to do it. And why did we botch those lessons? The lessons of the public health management of a national threat of contagion, the lessons of getting treatments in efficiently and quickly and getting them out to people. So those are things to regret. They're not irremediable, Dennis. Nothing in our country is irremediable. But the article I wrote that you opened up with our session a few moments ago speaks about the terrible cost.
Well, I wanted to ask you, I mean, there are a number of things I wanted to ask you about this article. I mean, we could have many hours since I've only got a half an hour. I did want to, it's such a, in typical style, such a beautifully written article, but such a powerful one. When you say, I'm going to come back to the fault lines, but you also say, highlighted a deeper problem. In tackling complex public health issues, we mistakenly take recourse to the blundering, blunt instrument of the criminal law. We coerce compliance with measures designed to save the public's health, first through brutal force, then through the stigma and shame that are criminally inescapable companions. This was desperately wrong. Why do we do that?
Dennis, that takes us back to our conversation about Johnny de Lange. Right. So we become a democracy 27 years ago. It's full of hope. The world's most famous prisoner is now the world's most famous president, Nelson Mandela. But we fail to carry through the lessons that he embodies in the Correctional Services Act of 1998. The lesson is of rehabilitation. It's not a retributive act. You have to do bad things to people who do bad things. You have to keep some very bad people in prison for very long. I don't deny all those things. But the basic premise of our Prisons Act, the Correctional Services Act, is rehabilitation, education, restoration to communities. At the same time as we enacting that act in 1998, we are adopting some of the world's harshest, most punitive sentencing provisions. And there's a race element to this, Dennis. We are both white men. But it's a black government punishing black perpetrators with the severest, some of the severest minimum sentencing legislation. Life sentences, Dennis, minimum sentences for fraud, for extortion, for uttering. Do you know what uttering is? I've forgotten what uttering is when you take a fake banknote and try to utter it to someone. Why a minimum sentence for that? Drugs, Dennis, a very important conversation for us to have, and maybe another time. It is the biggest public policy mistake of the last century, since 1920, has been this war against drugs. It has destroyed the political economies, the political structures of South and Central America. It's infested the American legal system and political structure. You don't deal with drugs by the criminal law. Let me get back to what your question was, Dennis. In fear at the outset of our democracy, we did not take recourse to rational criminal measures. The white minority was terrified about crime. In fact, the paradoxical fact is important. From about 1996 until 2011, the crime rate was going down. In 2011, you had half the number of murders, just over half the number of murders that you had in 1994. 1994, 29,000 murders, 2011, 16,000 murders. So we were actually going down. So Dennis, we lost our way in enacting these. And the point I'm making is that we got addicted to the big stick. And so when the COVID epidemic arrived, we took out the big step once again, the big stick once again. That was a terrible mistake.
But look at what the big stick did. And I want to mention these names because you mentioned them. And I'm so pleased you did, because people get forgotten in this issue. The people who've had effect. You talk about then people started getting killed. In Alexandra, Collins Koza, drinking beer on his stoop, was brutalized to death. More tragedies ensued. A rubber bullet seemingly randomly unexpected killed 9-year-old Leo Williams. Police beat Ntandu Sagasa. He died in his sleep. Petrus Michels tried to buy alcohol. He was beaten with a hammer. Police killed Sibusiso Amos. Adan Emmanuel was killed. Elma Matsumi, a transgender sex worker, died after police locked her up. And I think one of the ones that really affected me was little Julius, who was also murdered. And I remember when these murders took place, just feeling overwhelming grief. And what I'm interested in is, you're right, we are two white men. But I'm fascinated by the following, that all of these cases took place at a time when the American world, and then the world as large, reacted to the death of George Floyd in not dissimilar circumstances, spawning Black Lives Matter. Why was it that the majority of the population in South Africa, which includes the majority being Black, why did Black Lives not matter here? Why wasn't there the kind of protest, outrage, with regard to what you've documented here? I mean, it seems to me extraordinary that there wasn't. Now, I might be wrong because I don't watch Twitter, but so there may have been a lot going on there. But outside that, it didn't seem to me any of the anger which was exhibited under the George Floyd situation. Is that because we've just become almost dehumanized to this thanks to apartheid in our history? I don't know.
I don't think so, Dennis. I think the answer lies in that we were doing it to ourselves. We are a Black nation with a Black government, and apart from 10% of us who are white and another 10% of us who are colored and Indian, we are 80% Black. So I think it was more the sense that we were doing it to ourselves. Whereas I think in America, you had this hundreds years old legacy of unresolved legacy, unconfronted legacy of slavery, which still manifests in what happens to people like George Floyd. We have tricked ourselves, and this is where the young people on campus, I think, often make a good point. We've tricked ourselves into thinking that because we've got a constitution which is resonant with beautiful values, aspirational, soaring values, very precious values, and don't diss them. We've tricked ourselves because we've got that constitution into thinking we haven't kept the old patterns of the past, Dennis, the old hierarchies. We have taken over from apartheid the brutality of dealing with public sector policing, public security. So the Constitution has not made us use new methods. We've used apartheid's methods, even though we're now a Black nation and a Black government.
But then when you go on to say the pandemic has exposed existing fault lines engraved in our society, the inequalities, indignities and fears, illness and death from a new contagion intersected with existing poverty, violence, feminicide, mass incarceration, alcoholism and corruption. I suppose, again, I come back, I take your point that maybe when you do it to yourselves as opposed to the other, it somehow is different, although in fairness, the disproportionate violence always, as you rightly say, seems to basically fall on those who are poorer, who more because of grounds of race, sexual orientation, all of these questions, gender, alcoholism. The question, I suppose, is from whence now? I mean, this is a very powerful call you make. Do you have hope that not just people reading your article, but people perhaps listening to us, people talking in their own houses about this, do you have hope that, in fact, we are going to pause and think we've got to start the start button again?
I'm so glad you asked that, Dennis, because we have not stopped since Johnny DeLonge's minimum sentence legislation of 1997, 1998. We haven't stopped to say, how are we going to deal with the causes of crime? We the one thing that we can say, and your first academic posting was in fact as a criminologist, if I'm right,
Yeah,
Dennis.
yeah, that's right.
One thing we can say with absolute certainty is that long sentences don't reduce crime. They may be appropriate to keep people behind bars, they may be appropriate as punishment, but they don't reduce crime. So I'm glad you asked that, Dennis, because I think we can do better. Even Trump, who many people regard as a complete monster during his 4 years as president of the United States, he signed I think it's called the Next Step Act. The name just eludes me for a moment. A vital piece of sentencing reformulation. We must have that debate here. So your question is a hopeful question. What can we do? There's lots we can do. We've got to go back. We've got to stop criminalizing drugs, Dennis. If we stop criminalizing drugs, treat drugs as a public health problem, we will be able to deal with the drug dealers. We will take away the power of the drug kingpins. The trouble is that criminalizing drugs gives power to those who are feeding off the drug networks, including, regrettably, corrupt policemen and politicians. So we've got to remove that by going right to the root of the problem. We've got to stop giving minimum sentences for non-violent crimes. Take that all away. And then do the more difficult job, Dennis, which is to look at long sentencing. We have to understand, and I'm respectful. When I go onto the radio, I'm very respectful. People phone in and say, my daughter was killed, or my mom was murdered in a home invasion. And I have to humble myself before the anger that people rightly feel, anger and fear. So people want something done. I can't say to them that to select a small handful of rapists and murderers and put them away forever and lock them up and throw away the key is no answer. But we have to start going back a few steps and saying, what is the answer? We do have an answer, Dennis, and if you give me a chance, I'll
Please carry on.
Dennis, it goes back to crime intelligence. We know where crime intelligence is now. It's a complete mess because it was peopled with deployees who had a criminal mission. I think one can say that. Crime intelligence helps you to find out where the drain covers are going, where the syndicalized exporters are going, where the heists are being planned, where the cash and transit gangs are. Crime intelligence is the basis of a good crime response policy. Then there are other. It's a long haul, Dennis, but there's nothing that we cannot do if we set our minds to it. At the moment, we are flailing around without having a clear or coherent path, but we can get onto that path.
So let me ask you this just on that, because I want to move on to another topic, if I may. You mentioned Zaki Ahmad and, of course, Nathan Geffen and all of that extraordinary crew, and there are many others, who were part of the TAC, Treatment Action Campaign, and they were vital in a sense, creating the discourse and the political climate in which the courts finally came to very commendable decisions, both by Judge Chris Botha, who should be named because he was at the High Court level, and then, of course, by the Constitutional Court. I suppose my question is, where is the Treatment Action Campaign's equivalent now?
Dennis, you raise such a crucial question because it is the most vivid example of a successful civil society organization of our democracy, probably the most successful one in Africa and in the Southern Hemisphere. And why? Because it combined people from townships, suburbs. It was a single issue organization that sought to provide treatment. It first took on the drug companies, then it had to take on, very reluctantly, President Thabo Mbeki and his health minister, Dr. Mantu Chabalala Msimang. So you're asking really, where are the civil society organizations? And we need civil society initiatives to tackle the questions of over-policing, over-securitization, over-long sentences. But they're not very attractive issues. So we've got to ask our people, we've got to say, we are so busy flailing around in the water to stop drowning that we're not learning to swim. We've got to learn to swim. and we can do it.
Okay, so if I could, I mean, as much as I'd love to continue this, because time's running, I wanted to ask you about another topic. I mean, you know, wasn't all that long ago that you were on the Constitutional Court. Now you've retired, indeed, as have I, from mine. But
isn't today your retirement day, Dennis?
Well, strictly it was the 31st of December, Edwin. Stop being mischievous. The truth is I've had some far too heard matters.
But you've even been sitting in court today.
No, I had a labor appeal court because I've been helping them out in a really tricky case. Can I just ask you, what do you make of, you know, these increasing attacks on the judiciary from strange quarters? And I noticed that I was told today that a new group, Frank Chikani and a whole lot of people are going to have sort of defend the Constitution. You probably know more about this than I do. So there are moves afoot by various organizations to actually come to the defense of constitutionalism, therefore to the judiciary. But what do you make of this whole climate that we're in at the moment?
Dennis, I think it's about assets. And it's really, I think, the view that the rule of law and the Constitution inhibits some people who feel entitled to loot, to acquire assets, to accumulate capital. It inhibits them from doing so. So I see it in relatively stark terms that people who want to decry the Constitution, and there are a tiny number of judges who are in that number, who feel that the rule of law and the Constitution and constitutional values inhibit their acquisition of wealth. I fear it's as base as that. And
so I suppose, you know, the audience that's listening to us, which was not necessarily a bunch of lawyers, you know, when you talk about a small group, and I would agree it's a very small group, the majority of judges, I think, have done, you know, pretty well over a long period of time. But there does come a point when you have a sort of a retired president putting a finger up at the judiciary and a whole bunch of other people shouting the odds. There obviously, I suppose you would agree, a need for organizations like this group to come forward and start, as it were, illustrating what's going on. Is it because, to some extent, have we failed to inculcate into the public an idea how crucial this Constitution is to a society that may go forward towards democracy as opposed to one that can go back to autocracy?
I think you're putting it exactly the right way. And let us say, on the day that we are recording this, Dennis, the death was announced of President John Magufuli in Tanzania. And why it's important to raise that is that he started out well. He went to police stations, he went to service delivery points, he challenged corruption, he upbraided lazy civil servants. But within a few months, the autocratic, the homophobic side of him, why he's obsessed with a tiny minority of LGBTIQ people in Tanzania is inexplicable to me. So, Dennis, the importance is that we have a choice in South Africa. We can go the Edgar Lungu way in Zambia, where you suppress your opposition, the Museveni way, even the Kigali way with President Paul Kagame in Rwanda, where you suppress your opposition, you get 98% of the vote. The Magufuli way, he was re-elected late last year, before his premature death from COVID, in a highly contested election. That's our choice, Dennis, and that's why I'm glad you put it as strongly as that. We've got a choice between the inhibitions and the aspirations of the Constitution, which are thin gruel. They don't always nurture us, they don't always give us the sustenance we need. It's our only way, Dennis. Any other path leads us to the catastrophe that we've seen elsewhere in Eastern Europe. This is not only an African problem. Look at Belarus. Look at the Caucasian governments. There's catastrophe that invites us that way. And on the other hand, the rule of law, constitutional values, the mechanisms and the structures for creation of wealth, for reallocation of wealth, all exist there. But we have to have a recommitment, as you say.
But when you speak about, in fact, again, coming back as we conclude to your article, you make the point quite rightly that COVID has essentially cast a lens over the physics of our society. And for very many people, I suspect for many people who you've got to deal with in your capacity as inspector general, inspecting judge, come from massive communities where, in fact, they're still presently disadvantaged as much as they were historically disadvantaged. And the question, I suppose, is then, how are we going to actually redress that? Because unless there's an economic congruence between the economy and the Constitution, I'm afraid we're going to be in the same problem that we've been. And so, you know, do you see that finally people are starting to grasp the nettle on that particular point?
Well, you know better than I do, Dennis. You are head of a tax commission. You realize the grave problems we have in sustaining the civil service salary bill, social grants, which are absolutely indispensable. You and I agree on that. We probably even agree on a basic income grant. So we know that to have all of those things, you have to have a generative economy, which at the moment we haven't got. And I fear the signs are at best mixed and often quite dismal on getting that economy going.
So you were in the Constitutional Court where many of these cases came up where distributional questions were at stake. I mean, are we requiring too much for our courts? In other words, because politics fails, we turn to the courts. And I mean, are the burdens being placed on the courts now of such a nature that one, going back to our earlier question, one can understand why controversy flows, because we're asking them to do things that actually should be fixed by the political system. Did you feel that as a judge?
Dennis, I know that you've said that before, and I didn't agree with you when you said that before, and I don't agree with it now. I don't think so, Dennis. We have a constitution which unavoidably imposes huge duties on judges. So I don't think the judges are overreaching themselves when they decide those issues. And of course, especially in the Constitutional Court, there's very much a sense of a conversation with the legislature. This is what we're going to do because we know you can always change it if you don't like what we've done. You can change the legislation within the bounds of constitutional validity. So there's a conversation between judges and the legislature. This is not a judicial aristocracy or jurors, whatever aristocracy that And so I don't think that there's been an over-judicialization of problems. I do agree that when Parliament was not functioning, the opposition parties came to us in 2016, and Chief Justice Mogoeng gave what is rightly hailed as one of the 5 most important judges of our democratic era, which required Parliament to hold President Zuma to account and required a system for pay back the money. That was the judgment of the 31st of March 2016. So unavoidably, judges are taking a burden where other democratic institutions have failed. But each time they've been saying to Parliament, this is what you should be doing. This is what the executive should be doing. Now get on and do it. We don't want to have to do it ourselves.
That's an important point. Edwin, unfortunately, I've run out of time, but I just wanted to say a number of things, but just as a brief, number one is I would hope that everybody will read this article, which you can certainly acquire by simply Googling Edwin Cameron News 24, and you will find the article there to enforce the COVID lockdown, etc. Secondly, you know, let me again pay tribute to you for the work that you're doing in the prisons. And I hope that, in fact, to some extent, the kind of remarks that you're making are going to percolate right through the judicial system, apart from the parliamentarians, because both the judges and the parliamentarians are actually responsible for the sentencing practices. And I'm going to end by saying, you know, from time to time, and I'm sure many of you who listen to this program will feel the same as me, we go through very bleak and gloomy and dark periods. And then when I think to myself, certainly as someone in the legal profession, that I, over my years on the judiciary, was privileged to encounter people like Pi, and I mentioned that particularly Edwin Cameron, I feel since they're here, how bad can South Africa be? Edwin, thank you very much for this afternoon.
Thank you, Dennis. What a joy. Thank you.